They burned the last mural on a Tuesday. Cale watched from the shadow of a collapsed water tower, his back pressed against rust-eaten steel, his breath held low and even. The Veth patrol moved in a delta formation across the plaza. 3 of them, their carapaces the color of old bruises, ultraviolet receptors scanning the walls in slow, methodical sweeps. One of them raised a limb that ended not in fingers but in a pressurized nozzle, and the mural dissolved. Not burned exactly, dissolved. Whatever solvent the Veth used broke paint down to its component molecules in under 4 seconds, leaving behind a surface so clean, it looked like the wall had never been touched by anything at all. That was the point. The Veth did not destroy art because they feared rebellion. They destroyed it because they genuinely could not understand why it existed. That was what the xenosociology briefings had said. Back when there were still briefings. Back when there were still people issuing them. The Veth were a civilization that communicated entirely through pheromone-coded data packets and bioluminescent pulse sequences. They had no concept of aesthetic expression. None, not repressed, absent. The idea that a creature would spend time and resources producing a visual pattern with no informational function was, to a Veth mind, a symptom of cognitive malfunction. So they treated it like one. Cale waited until the patrol rounded the corner of what had been the municipal library, then moved. 17 steps across open ground, counting them the way his grandmother had taught him to count anything frightening. One at a time, fast, without hesitation. He reached the far wall and pressed himself flat. In his coat pocket he had 3 cans of spray paint. He had traded 3 days of water rations to obtain. Red, yellow, the faded, dusty blue that passed for sky color in the settlement. He had been doing this for 8 months. Not because he thought it would change anything. Not because he had some grand political vision. He did it because the walls were blank. And blank walls made people's eyes go somewhere bad. He had seen it. The way the settlers would stare at the scrubbed surfaces for too long. The way their faces would go slack and emptied. The Veth had learned in quickly that you didn't need to cage a population if you could remove everything that reminded them they had an interior life. The occupation had lasted 14 months. There were no mass executions, no labor camps. Just the patrols. Just the dissolution of every word, every image, every scratched initial in wet concrete. The Veth were patient. They were willing to wait for the humans to simply forget what they were. Cale uncapped the red can and started at the lower left of the wall. He worked from the feet up, always. His old art teacher, a woman named Dobrescu, who had died in the first month, not from Veth violence but from a simple infection, because the medical facility had been cordoned for resource recalibration, had told him that any figure worth painting was worth painting from the ground up. Start with what grounds them, she said. Start with where they stand. He painted a woman standing. He didn't know her name. She was nobody specific and everybody specific. Work-worn boots, a posture that said exhausted but upright, hands that were open rather than clenched because he didn't want to paint fury, exactly. He wanted to paint the thing that existed before fury, the thing that made fury worth having. He heard the radio crackle in his earpiece, static mostly. But underneath it, if you listened the right way, you could pick up the fragments the resistance broadcast on the edge of frequencies the Veth didn't monitor. The old analog bands, which the Veth had no equipment to detect because nothing in their civilization had ever used them. It wasn't messages exactly. It was more like proof of life. Someone out there still transmitting. He worked faster. The figure on the wall was nearly complete when he heard the footsteps. Not the Veth patrol. Veth didn't have footsteps in any human sense. They moved on 6 limbs in a gait that produced a sound like dry leaves dragged across stone. These were boots. Human boots. "You're going to get yourself killed," said the voice. He turned. She was leaning against the far corner of the alley, arms folded, watching him with an expression he couldn't immediately classify. Not hostile, not friendly, something in between that felt more honest than either. She was perhaps his age, perhaps younger, with dust in her hair and a cut above one eyebrow that had healed badly. In her hand she held a piece of charcoal, the improvised kind made from scorched wood, the simplest drawing implement you could construct from nothing. "You've been watching me," he said. It was not an accusation. "I've been watching the walls," she said. "You're just the one making them." Her name was Elia. He learned this, and almost nothing else, that first night, because the patrol returned early. The Veth had begun varying their routes. An adaptation the settlement coordinator's network had flagged 2 weeks ago, and they had to run, separately, through the wreckage of what had been a shopping district. He lost her in the dark. But the next morning, When he went to check the wall he'd painted, he found the figure he had drawn was not alone anymore. Beside his standing woman, rendered in charcoal with a precision that made his spray-can work look clumsy by comparison, was a second figure. A man, leaning toward the first figure at an angle that suggested listening. Not looking at her. Listening, he stood in front of it for a long time. The Veth dissolved both figures by noon. But the wall after that, a concrete retaining barrier behind what remained of the water processing plant. He found her work again the morning after he painted it. She had added to his image without altering it. That was the thing he kept returning to. She never changed what he had made. She only extended it, the way a sentence can be extended by a word that makes everything, before it means something different. He left a piece of charcoal on the ground near the wall. The next night he found it had been used. They communicated entirely in images for 3 weeks, before they found a safe enough space to speak again. Safe was relative. The settlement's remaining population, approximately 4,300 people, down from 12,000 before the occupation, lived under a loose form of supervised self-governance, the Veth enforced through the presence of what the settlers called watchers. A watcher was not a weapon. It was a monitoring device, roughly the size and shape of a traffic cone, that the Veth planted at intervals throughout the settlement. It processed visual and chemical data. It did not punish directly. It recorded and transmitted, and eventually a patrol would arrive. The trick which Kale had worked out in the first month was timing. The watchers transmitted in burst cycles, not continuously. There were gaps. The gaps were short, between 90 seconds and 4 minutes, depending on the unit and its charge level. But they were real, and if you knew where the watchers were and could read the faint luminescent flicker that preceded a transmission burst, you could move through the settlement in those gaps and leave almost no trace. Almost, the Veth were learning. That was the other thing the briefings had said. Back when there were briefings, and it was the one piece of information Kale had found himself believing completely, the Veth adapted. Not quickly. They were a deliberative species, collective decision-making that involved something like a colony-wide consensus process, but steadily and without ego, which made them more dangerous than any enemy who needed to be right. An enemy who needs to be right will sometimes choose rightness over effectiveness. The Veth had no such vulnerability. He found her in what had been a restaurant kitchen, 3 streets from the center of the old commercial district. She was drawing on the wall with the charcoal. Not painting the wall, drawing on paper she had pinned to it, using the flat surface as a backing. When he came in, she didn't startle. She folded the paper and looked at him with that same expression he couldn't classify. They dissolved the last 3 walls in under 6 hours, she said.
I know. That's faster. Last week.
I know. He sat on an overturned crate. I'm not stopping. She studied him for a moment. Why not? He thought about how to answer that honestly, and he said, because when they dissolve it, I can see it upset them. Not upset, that's the wrong word, disoriented. The patrols pause for longer than usual in front of a wall before they dissolve it, like they're trying to understand it and failing. He paused. Something that can fail to understand us is something we can beat. She was quiet for a while. Then she unfolded the paper and showed it to him. It was a map, not of the settlement, of the watcher positions, annotated with symbols he didn't immediately recognize, that turned out, as she explained, to represent her estimated transmission timing data, collected over 6 weeks of observation. He stared at it. You've been running the gaps, he said. We've been running the gaps, she said. I've seen your paths. You're sloppy on the east side. I know. There's a cluster of 3 watchers near the old school that you always route around, but there's a blind corridor between the 2nd and 3rd units where the transmission cones don't overlap. If you go through there, you add 40 seconds to any gap you're working in. He looked at the map more carefully. She was right. Who else knows about this, he said. Nobody. I've been, she stopped. I wasn't trying to organize anything. I just needed to know the shape of the cage. He understood that completely. You had to know the shape of a thing before you could decide what to do about it. His brother, Lawrence, who had been a mid-level administrator in the pre-occupation city government and had been folded smoothly into the Veth's collaborative governance structure. Not from cowardice, but from a kind of pragmatic grief that Kale could not bring himself to entirely condemn. His brother had told him once, early in the occupation, that the best you could do was learn to live within the new structure, not collaboration, survival. His brother drew a distinction between the two that Kale had spent 8 months failing to accept. But looking at Ilya's map, he thought, This is also a form of survival. Knowing the shape, refusing to stop seeing, they started working together after that. Not the art, the logistics. Which walls, which timing windows, how to move materials, how to diversify the locations. So the dissolution patrols couldn't predict where the next image would appear. They brought in 3 others over the following month. A former civil engineer named Praxis, who could read structural load data and identify walls that would take paint most visibly from the greatest distance. A teenager named Sivi, whose only qualification was that she could run faster than anyone else in the settlement, and had memorized the patrol patterns for the entire western quarter, and an old man who had been a professional sign painter before the occupation, and who insisted on being called Marks because his actual name was too long. They were not a resistance cell. They kept telling themselves that. They were 5 people who painted walls in the dark. The Veth noticed anyway. The change was subtle at first. Additional patrol sweeps in the hours before dawn. Watcher units repositioned. The dissolution teams began arriving within 3 hours of a new image appearing, rather than the previous average of 6 to 8. Someone in the collective decision-making structure of the Veth Occupation Command had flagged the painted walls as significant, not as a political threat. Kale still didn't think the Veth understood rebellion in any meaningful sense, but as an anomaly, an information pattern with no informational content. Something kept recurring, despite being repeatedly eliminated. To the Veth, that meant one thing: malfunction. A persistent malfunction in the human population required direct intervention. The first arrest came on a Thursday. They took Marks. A patrol caught him 2 blocks from a fresh wall. He had stayed too long, admiring what they'd done, and missed the transmission cycle. Kale saw it happen from across the street and could not do anything except watch as 2 Veth enforcers, specialized units, larger than the standard patrol carapaces, with limbs that ended in restraint fields rather than dissolution nozzles, guided him away with the terrifying gentleness that the occupation had always used. Not violence, redirection, a burlap hood that blocked his visual processing, efficient, clean. Marks didn't come back. The settlement coordinator's network, what remained of it, reported that he had been transferred to a cognitive recalibration facility. This was the first time KL had heard that phrase. He asked 3 people what it meant and got 3 answers that were all variations on the same horrifying theme. The Veth had developed a process that was not quite torture in any physical sense, but which targeted the faculty of aesthetic perception specifically. The ability to see pattern as beautiful. The ability to derive meaning from visual form that had no survival function. They could locate it in a human brain, and they could reduce it, not eliminate it. The neurology was too distributed for complete removal. But they could damage it enough that a person came back and looked at a painting and felt nothing. Saw color as data, saw composition as spatial arrangement, saw human faces in images as face-shaped regions. Sevi cried when she heard this. Praxis went very still and quiet for a long time. Elia did not react visibly, but that night she painted alone, without coordinating with the others, on a wall Kale found the next morning. Not the usual collaborative expansion of shared images, but something dense and private and angry, a thing she had needed to get out of herself onto a surface that was not herself. He didn't add to it, he left it alone. Kale went to see his brother. Lawrence lived in the administrative quarter, a section of the settlement that the Veth had designated for governance cooperative personnel, and maintained at a marginally higher standard than the rest. The buildings were intact. The streets were clean. There were no blank walls here, because Lawrence's administrative colleagues had been permitted to hang photographs inside their residences. Private expression. Contained, not visible to the general population, not contaminating the controlled information environment of the occupation. His brother opened the door and looked at him the way you look at something you love, that keeps costing you. "You need to stop," Lawrence said. "Marks is gone, I know, and I am sorry. I am truly sorry." Lawrence stood aside to let him in. The room was small and clean, and there were photographs on the walls. Their parents, a mountain range Kale had never seen, an old city skyline. Kale stood in the middle of the room and looked at all of it. "You are going to get yourself seen," his brother said. "And then you will come back and you will be different." "Yes." "Is that what they told you?" Kale said. "That they'll just make us different? That it's not so bad?" Lawrence sat down heavily. "They told me it's reversible." "Is it?" His brother didn't answer. "I need the patrol schedules," Kale said. "The ones from the governance network. Not the public ones. The actual ones." "I can't give you those, Lawrence. If I give you those and they trace it back to me, they'll make you different too. The silence in the room was long enough to hear the distant sound of a Veth patrol moving through a street somewhere outside, the dry leaf drag of 6 limbs on pavement. There's a data cache, his brother said finally. At the old records building. I can't give you the files, but I can tell you where they are. And I can tell you that the monitoring on that building has a recalibration window at 0340 every 4th day, because the watcher there runs on a different charging cycle and they haven't standardized it yet. Kale looked at his brother for a moment. Then he crossed the room and put his hand briefly on his brother's shoulder, a gesture that felt both insufficient and exactly right, and he left. He told Elia that night. She listened to the information about the data cache and the monitoring window, and then she said, "That's not all you want to do." "No," he said. "What else?" He had been thinking about it since the morning when the Veth patrol had paused in front of one of his walls. The pause. The thing that looked like confusion in a species that had no facial expressions. Only carapace orientation and receptor positioning. The equivalent of a head turning. Trying to resolve something that wouldn't resolve. He had thought about it again when he heard about what the recalibration facilities did. How they targeted the specific human capacity to find meaning in pattern. The Veth were trying to eliminate that, which meant they understood, on some level, that it was the thing they couldn't compute. The thing that made humans legible to themselves and illegible to their occupiers. He said, "I want to paint something they can't dissolve." She looked at him for a long moment. "The concrete isn't the problem," she said. "They can dissolve anything surface level." "I know." He laid out what he had in mind. Not surface paint, not exterior walls. He had spent a week, 2 weeks, thinking about what surface the Veth would never think to treat with the dissolution solvent, because they had no category for it. The Veth were a species with no concept of aesthetic expression. But they had learned to monitor walls, because humans kept using walls. They had learned to dissolve paint. They had adapted. They were good at adapting to behaviors they encountered. But they had never encountered a behavior they had no reference point for. He said, "The road." She stared at him. "The main avenue," he said. "The one that runs from the governance quarter to the central watcher hub. Every patrol walks it. Every Veth in the settlement has to cross it. They look at walls. They don't look down." Elia was quiet for a long time. Then she started to smile, and the smile was the most frightening and alive thing he had seen in 8 months. They planned it for 3 weeks. Praxis ran the structural analysis and found that the road surface was a composite material the Veth had installed over the original asphalt. Harder, more resistant to wear from their 6-limb locomotion pattern. But it was still porous at the microscopic level, and the paint Kale had sourced. Not spray cans this time. He had spent every remaining trade credit they collectively possessed on pigment concentrate that CV had identified in an abandoned supply depot. Would bond to porous surfaces at a molecular depth that the dissolution solvent could not fully reach without damaging the substrate itself. The Veth would have to tear up the road. They would have to make a choice. Elia drew the design. She worked on it for 2 weeks, in the abandoned kitchen, in charcoal on paper, filling 12 sheets with iterations and revisions. Kale watched her work and did not offer suggestions, because she was doing something he couldn't have done. She was taking all of it, everything that had happened, and everything that was still happening, and finding its shape, the standing figures, the listening figures, the blank walls, and the dissolved colors, and Marx's empty seat in the group, and the sound of the static on the radio that was also someone still transmitting. She found the shape of all of it, and she drew it. It covered 12 sheets of paper. On the road, it would need to cover approximately 400 square meters. They had one window. The watcher recalibration cycle that Lawrence had told him about extended, at its widest, 40 minutes. Praxis had calculated that the 3 blind corridor gaps in the watcher network, combined with the recalibration window and a patrol schedule deviation they had identified using the data from the records building, would give them a maximum of 62 minutes of low detection movement in the target area. They needed all of it. 5 people, 400 square meters, 62 minutes. They went on a night when the wind was still, because the pigment concentrate required still air to bond correctly, and because Kale wanted the image to be complete when the Veth found it. Not scattered or smeared, complete. CV ran the perimeter, silent, watching for early patrols. Praxis managed the material distribution, having divided the design into a grid and preloaded each sector's paint requirements into individual containers, so there was no time lost to improvisation. Marx's absence was felt as a specific weight at the center of the group. He had been the fastest painter, the most technically precise. And no one mentioned it, which was its own kind of mention. Elia directed. She had the full design in her head, in a way that was almost frightening to watch. She moved between sectors with absolute certainty, correcting the lines that were drifting, adjusting scale, maintaining the compositional coherence across 400 square meters of road surface in near total darkness. She worked by the light of small chemical glow strips, the same kind used for emergency marking, held inches from the surface. Cale painted what he was told to paint, where he was told to paint it, faster than he had ever painted anything in his life. At 47 minutes, CV clicked twice on the radio. Early patrol movement, east approach. They had 13 minutes. Cale looked at what they had finished. Approximately 310 square meters. 90 short, he looked at Elia. Go, she said. I'll finish. No, Cale, she said it with a flatness that was not anger. The section that's left is the center, I know it. I can do it faster than you. She paused. Go. Get the others clear. He looked at her for 2 seconds, which was exactly the time he could afford. He saw her face in the glow strip light, not afraid, or rather, afraid and completely undeflected by it. He had seen this before, in the drawings she had left on walls in response to his, in the density of what she had made the night after Marx disappeared. She had a capacity for holding fear and continuing anyway that was not the absence of fear. It was something else, something specifically human. He grabbed her wrist, pulled her into him for 1 second. Let go. East exit, he said. 40 seconds after you're done. Yes, she said. He moved. The three of them cleared the area in 11 minutes, routing through the blind corridor, using the recalibration gap. Cale positioned himself at the east end of the corridor, watching the patrol approach from 200 meters. Elia came through at the 38-second mark. He exhaled something that had been held in his chest for the last 6 months. They found somewhere safe, and they waited for morning. The Veth patrol encountered the image at 0614. Cale and Elia watched from the upper window of an empty residential block through a gap in the boarded glass. The patrol moved at its standard pace, delta formation, and then it stopped. All 3 units stopped simultaneously. This had never happened with a wall painting. Wall paintings caused a pause in 1 or 2 units at most, then dissolution, then resume. This was different. All 3 units stopped and did not move. Their ultraviolet receptors, the organs in their carapace that functioned as sensory arrays, swept through its surface in a way Cale had never seen before, slow and wide and repetitive, as if running the same calculation and getting results that couldn't be right. The image on the road was the standing woman from his first wall, but she was not standing alone now. Around her, radiating outward across 400 square meters of road surface, were other figures, hundreds of them, human figures, in charcoal pigment linework, every one of them different, every one of them oriented not toward some central vanishing point but toward each other, facing each other, looking at each other and being seen. Above them, worked into the sky-colored background pigment so subtly it was almost subliminal, Elia had written words. Not slogans, not demands, just the names of things, sky, water, music. The color of my grandmother's kitchen in the afternoon. The exact weight of a sleeping child. Things with no informational function. Things the Veth could not process as data because they were not data. They were the residue of being a particular kind of creature in a particular world, accumulated over thousands of years, as specific as a fingerprint and as general as a heartbeat. A second patrol arrived, then a third. The road was, within 20 minutes, ringed by Veth units, none of them dissolving, all of them stopped in the same impossible pause. Cale's radio crackled. Through the static, still the static, always the static. He heard something that resolved for the first time in 8 months, into words. A voice, a real voice saying, "We are watching, we see what you did. Stand by." He looked at Elia. She was looking at the road, at all of it, at what they had made. "They're calling their command structure," he said. "They're reporting an anomaly they don't have a category for." "Good," she said. "They'll dissolve it eventually." "Yes," she said. "And then we'll paint another one." The word came through the resistance network 14 days later. 3 other settlements had done the same. Road images. Or building facades too large to dissolve without structural damage. Or the one community in the southern district that had started painting the Watcher units themselves, covering the carapaces in handmade pigment that the Watchers then broadcast through their own transmission systems, sending images of human art directly to the Veth command network on frequencies the Veth used for official communication. The settlement coordinator who reported that particular innovation sounded almost embarrassed by its elegance. The VETH collective decision process took 19 days. Kale knew this because his brother, who had started leaving specific data unlocked on specific terminals at specific times, reported it through channels that were technically not reportable through those channels, but that Lawrence had apparently decided were worth the risk. The decision: escalate from cognitive recalibration to full population transfer. Remove the humans from the settlements entirely. Place them in controlled environments where there were no surfaces to paint on. Kale read this and felt something cold and very clear settle in him. He said to Ilya, "They're scared." "The Veth don't get scared," she said. "Not scared the way we use the word." He looked at the decision report. "But there's something here that functions like fear. An adaptive response to an unresolvable problem. They can dissolve paint. They can dissolve graffiti. They can tune a brain to not see beauty in pattern." He set the report down. "They cannot dissolve the reason we make it. They can't find that in a brain and remove it because it's not in a brain. It's in the fact of being human, it's in what we are, and the only thing they know to do about it is move us somewhere else." He paused. "You can't win a war by always moving somewhere else." She looked at him. "So what do? We make sure every settlement has the road design and the timing data before the transfer order is implemented," he said. "And we make sure every resistance contact in every settlement knows that when the Veth come to move them, they don't run, they paint. That will get people killed," she said. Evenly, not as an objection, as a fact. "Yes," he held her gaze. "So will waiting." What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. There were no weapons, no fortifications, no tactical engagements. What happened was a kind of persistent, coordinated, escalating proof. Settlers in 14 communities painting simultaneously, painting everything, painting the streets and the watcher units and the patrol vehicles, and in one extraordinary instance in the northern settlement, painting a full-scale reproduction of a Veth enforcer's carapace pattern, painstakingly researched and accurately rendered, on the side of a water tower. Not mocking it, depicting it accurately the way a portrait depicts a subject. Seeing it fully, holding it in attention, saying, "We see what you are." The Veth Collective could not process this. It built their occupation on the certainty that the thing humans did with surfaces was a malfunction, compulsive, irrational, targetable. They had spent 14 months treating it as a deviation to be corrected. They had not once considered the possibility that it was a technology. Not paint and pigment the practice. The practice of taking the inside of a person and placing it on a surface outside the person, where another person could see it and be changed by it. The practice of transmitting not information but experience, not data, but the shape of what it felt like to be alive in a particular body in a particular moment. Communication at a depth the Veth pheromone network could not reach. Through a channel they had no equipment to monitor. The Occupation Command issued 3 more escalation orders in 8 days. Then the orders stopped. Kale heard about the withdrawal before it was announced publicly. His brother sent a message through one of the data channels. 3 words that were technically not 3 words, but a file path, with 3 words embedded in the directory names. A system he and Lawrence had worked out, as children, for leaving each other notes their parents wouldn't understand. The 3 words were, "They are leaving, he didn't celebrate." He stood in the middle of the road, in the middle of the image they had painted, surrounded by 4 months of accumulated overpainting. The original design had been dissolved and repainted 6 times, each iteration richer and denser than the last. Each dissolution followed within 48 hours by a new image that incorporated the dissolved one's ghost in the fresh pigment. So the road had become a kind of palimpsest, layer on layer of human attention, and he stood in the middle of it and felt something he did not immediately have a word for. Elia found him there. She stood beside him, and they both looked at what was on the road. "It's ugly in places," he said. "I know," she tilted her head. "It's also kind of extraordinary. I painted that bottom left section when CV was running the east perimeter warning, and I had 40 seconds. It shows. It shows that you had 40 seconds, she said. That's not the same as showing nothing." He thought about that. He thought about the road and the walls, and Mark's, and the static on the radio, and his brother's face in the clean room surrounded by photographs in the Veth patrols, stopped in their tracks. Receptor arrays sweeping the same surface over and over, trying to find the meaning in something that was not meaning in the way they understood meaning, but was meaning in the only way that it ever mattered. "What do we do now?" he said. "I don't know about you," Elia said, But I'm going to paint something that isn't about any of this. He looked at her. Something beautiful, she said, for no reason. Something that costs nothing, and proves nothing, and means nothing except that I wanted to make it. She was quiet for a moment. That's what they were afraid of, you know. Not the resistance. Not the logistics of it. Not the data breaches. Not any of the organized pieces. She looked at him directly. They were afraid of a person making something for no reason. Because a thing made for no reason cannot be explained by survival. Cannot be explained by need. It can only be explained by being human, he said yes. He reached into his coat. He had one can left blue, the faded sky color. He had been carrying it for 3 months on a kind of superstition. The last reserve, the thing you kept, because something should always be kept. He handed it to her. She took it, turned it over in her hands, looked at him with the expression he had never been able to classify. And now, standing here, he thought maybe it wasn't one thing. Maybe it was a human expression in the full sense, which meant it was several things at once and resisted reduction. Relief and stubbornness, grief and amusement. The face of someone who has been through something long and had not been diminished by it. She turned to the road and she painted a bird, not a symbol, not a metaphor, not a political bird or a hope bird or any of the kinds of birds that appear at the end of things to mean something. A bird as a bird, its specific weight implied in the angle of its wing, its specific humor implied in the tilt of its head, particular and unrepeatable and made for no reason at all. The sun came through the dust above the settlement and lit the road. He watched her paint and he did not look away.